Let's discover how citrus and railroads shaped Winter Garden's history and the role that these two Central Florida staples played in shaping the Winter Garden of today.
It's definitely a city that has done a great job of preserving its integrity and culture and history for sure, but it's also a city that's not afraid of growth, and also with that growth not losing sight of its history. So they've done a really great job of preserving everything, preserving the integrity of what was happening here at one time, but also revitalizing. And also it's a city that has really embraced all the newcomers and has really taken good care of their citizens. In that respect, old, young alike can all come to Winter Garden and walk away with, wow, this is a city that cares.
Winter Garden basically became Winter Garden because of its agricultural possibilities. Surrounding Lake Apopka, the at the time third largest lake in the state, when people started arriving in the mid-19th century, the ground was just mucky and fertile and great for anything. Settlers started growing, these were after the Native Americans, of course, after the Seminole Wars. They started growing cotton and corn and turpentine. They harvested from trees. Eventually citrus, and then vegetables. So anything basically grew in the soil around Lake Apopka because of the muck. You could grow all year round. The weather was great all year round, hence you could have a garden in the winter, winter garden. That's the most plausible tale we've come up with. The land was inexpensive. It was in the middle of the state. This is Florida in the mid-19th century, 1850s, 1860s. It's before the Civil War. Relatively peaceful. The Indian Removal Commission, not the best part of our history, had the Seminoles go, and that was after 3 Seminole Wars. Land was open and people homesteaded very inexpensively, free or just pennies on the dollar, and picked up property and started growing. They were basically farmers who came down here from the Carolinas and the Deep South, and this was their livelihood. So this is what they did here, but on a lot more acreage. Agriculturally, of course, that's our main thing. We have a gentleman who lived here, his family still lives here, Hoyle Pounds. He was an inventor, grower. He came up with the idea for rubber tractor tires, which revolutionized the industry because their tractors worked so much better in the orange groves, and in the sandy orange groves, I should say, and they also didn't destroy the brick roads that we were putting in the 1920s. So this was revolutionary. He started putting those tractors together, hired a lot of people, and we also, we have a war hero, George McMillan, a flying tiger. There's not too many of those. He's featured very heavily locally. He flew missions over Southeast Asia, came back, a hero. They gave him a parade. He got a little tired of just hanging around here. The war was still on, so he went back and unfortunately was shot down in 1944. So basically it's about the people here, the people who made a mark and helped the area gain a little bit of notoriety. It's kind of a stick together kind of a thing. They all had to help each other. You know, you're in the middle of nowhere. You've got to depend on each other, black and white. And today the spirit is more or less, after all the challenges Winter Garden has had over the years, it's like, well, we had to pull together again in the 1980s, 1990s to keep this town going. So the pioneer spirit stayed with us, even if it was people who were not from here. The whole idea of saving something and preserving something and keeping it going, that has endured. Typical southern town, there was an African-American side, there was a white side. That was just typical across the South, as you know. We had a neighborhood in Winter Garden, East Winter Garden, which is where historically the African-American population lived. And way early in this part of the 20th century, say the 20s and 30s, with citrus and all, even young folks were expected to work in the groves and in the packing industry outside. They weren't necessarily expected to get a full education. So it's rather interesting, I think, and it's really special that a couple named Juanita and William Maxey came to this area from Jacksonville in 1937 to essentially teach the African-American kids of Winter Garden. And there was a small Rosenwald wooden school which wasn't hardly big enough for the kids who used to, they began getting educated in churches. They expanded the building over the years, moved it to a better block, added to it, and these folks were just insisting that the African-American kids get an education, not just go to school 2 days a week and work in the fields the rest. They were just as important as everybody else. And by early 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s, there was a high school for African-American kids in Winter Garden, Drew High School, and Mr. Maxey at that time became the principal. So that was a major step, that an African-American couple came to Winter Garden to improve education for these kids who deserved it, just like everybody else. They're really special people. Downtown was beginning to dry up when all the businesses moved to Highway 50. And through the 80s, another decade of trouble, we had hard freezes 3 times, knocked everything to the ground. People stayed here. They had small businesses, they lived here, and people weren't willing to let the town just get knocked down. They wanted to tear down the Edgewater at one point, and that's what mobilized locals to say, no, that's an important part of our town. Maybe we should do something better with it. So it turned into a bed and breakfast eventually. That was the first project that the Winter Garden Heritage Foundation was involved with.
The foundation itself, the Winter Garden Heritage Foundation, started in 1994 when a group of citizens here in Winter Garden decided that they were going to band together to save the Edgewater Hotel, which is down the street. And so their main goal was the restoration of the hotel, saving it, and that was the catalyst for restoring a lot of buildings here in downtown Winter Garden.
The second major preservation project we did was the Garden Theater. That began in 2003, and after 5 years and a few $1 million, we had a major performing arts center in the heart of this little town, and it's been really good ever since. That started out as the Garden Theater. The second Garden Theater, built in 1935 to replace one right next door that burned in 1934, and it was one of 4 theaters we had in town over the decades, and it's still with us. It was at one point taken over by Pounds next door, the inventor-grower, who used it as a warehouse for his tractor parts and assembly. That was when there was no theater, when that closed in 1963, but 4 decades later it was back up and roaring, and it's an important part of downtown Winter Garden. It brings a lot of people here.
From the creation of the Winter Garden Heritage Foundation, subsequently then came the creation of this Heritage Museum housed here in order to highlight the history of the area and also to showcase the pieces that the foundation started collecting, because then after it restored the Edgewater Hotel, that moved on to the Garden Theater, but then they started collecting, and all of that stuff had to be displayed and interpreted somewhere, and that's how the Heritage Museum came about.
We had all this architecture just sitting here empty, which eventually became filled with shops thanks to the West Orange Trail that brought hundreds of thousands of people through downtown. That was a blessing. And the fact that we have 2 depots, 2 railroad depots in this little town. They're both museums run by the Winter Garden Heritage Foundation, of course. It snowballed. The city is very involved with saving its character as well. We don't knock things down downtown. If something has been down and there's an empty lot, if we build something, it looks like it's been there for 50 years or 100 years. So it's an architectural legacy. It's a middle-class life that has been preserved and just not ignored. What's great is that the buildings, everything that you see on Plant Street is at least from 1912 to the 1950s, early 1960s. There are very few new buildings, and they've all been repurposed. Our center is here still. We'll have groups of people come from different chambers of commerce or city governments to ask us how we did it. How did we do it? We're like, well, the West Orange Trail helped, and we did have the 2 depots as museums, and we have all the architecture. So it's almost like you have to turn around and see what you have and then work with it.
Our mission and our goal is to sort of be a community center for all kinds of dialogue. So not just history, but we really want to be viewed as the community's living room, a meeting place where organizations can come and talk about their various missions and goals and projects, and then we can help facilitate those discussions amongst other groups. We really want to become more of a community meeting place. Now we operate 3 locations: Heritage Museum, Central Florida Railroad Museum, and now our outreach has gotten larger because now we operate the History, Research and Education Center, which houses not only an archive but also a gift shop and visitor center that serves as the official welcome center for the city of Winter Garden. It's definitely a city that has done a great job of preserving its integrity and culture and history for sure, but it's also a city that's not afraid of growth, and also with that growth not losing sight of its history. So they've done a really great job of preserving the integrity of what was happening here at one time, but also revitalizing. And also it's a city that has really embraced all the newcomers and has really taken good care of their citizens. So in that respect, old, young alike, can all come to Winter Garden and walk away with, wow, this is a city that cares.
Citrus played such an important role in shaping the history of Central Florida, and Winter Garden is no exception. Like so many other communities in the region, Winter Garden's history is one of agriculture and citrus, and the legacy left behind by the men and women who owned, operated, and worked the thousands of acres of groves that shaped the area.